All right, folks. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I think we're going to have a few more people joining us over the next few minutes, but excited to have you guys with us for the first detector workshop here in Pasco County. So this is a really important workshop. It's kind of an opportunity for you guys to learn about a wide variety of things concerning invasive pests that are potential problems here in Florida and can creep over into Pasco County, any of our surrounding counties really, and then really become basically a citizen scientist, if you will. And hopefully you'll be able to help us with tracking some of these things, recognizing, identifying, tracking them, and helping us maybe even prevent some of these things from becoming invasive pests that do quite a bit of damage potentially here in Florida. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'm going to kick it over to Shannon here. And I'm Dr. Whitney Elmore. I am the County Extension Director and Urban Horticulture Agent for the University of Florida here in Pasco County. And so been working with Shannon McAmis that is on here, and she's going to introduce herself a little bit further here in just a second. She is a Pasco native. But she is up in Gainesville in the Doctor of Plant Medicine program, and she is helping to kind of spearhead right now this first detector workshop. So Shannon, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you.
Thanks, Whitney. Yeah, I'm really excited to be putting on this workshop. This is my first evening workshop, so you get the light shining on me, which might be blinding your screen, and I apologize for that. I don't have any shades. um, but yeah, I'm just super excited to be putting this on, and I'm hoping that we've got a smaller group today, but sometimes less is more. And so I'm hoping to have a fun workshop, talk about some interesting diseases going on with palms, and then also some palm weevils. And just a few housekeeping things. Please stay muted while the speakers are going to be talking. And we're going to be recording this. If you guys want to check it in, we'll be posting it on YouTube later. If you want to follow up again and look over some stuff. But we'll be going into some breakout groups. And so when you're in your breakout group, feel free to unmute, talk. That's the point of them, is to get some conversation going on with everybody. And you already met Whitney, and I'm Shannon. So we'll both be speaking, and then we also have our group leader here today is Sarah Taffel, who is going to be putting in. She's working after hours, and she's awesome. She's an undergrad at UF in the entomology department, so um, we want to be able to have all these breakout groups without our group leaders. So it's always awesome that they're able to chip in. And speaking of breakout groups, let me go ahead and set those up. All right. Did we all get back into the main room? Okay, great. Um, yeah, so Whitney just did a great introduction. So going over the topic of today, we're going to start by talking about some general um, just some general vocabulary about that people use when referring to um, invasive or introduced or native pests and pathogens. And then we're going to be talking about some specific examples of those when we get to the palms talk. Um, yeah, so first we're just going to take a little bit of a step back and talk exactly about what a species being invasive means, and just like Whitney was saying, how they even end up here in Florida. So let's get, you guys can type in the chat. I got a fun little question for you. There's these three species here, the Japanese honeysuckle, the honeybee, and the blueberry. And one of them is introduced, one of them is invasive, and one of them is native. And the answers are in the rest of my presentation, but go ahead and put your guesses of which one's which in the chat. But yeah, so I just named off three different words: native, introduced, invasive. And then some people will talk about non-native, exotic. And so there's a bunch of different words, which I guess is really good if you're in the dictionary business and you need more words for putting in the dictionary. But for everybody else, it gets really confusing. And sometimes these words get used interchangeably when they might not actually be that interchangeable. So yeah, this talk is just to get us all in the same vocabulary and kind of introduce the vocabulary that scientists and decision makers are going to use when they discuss different plant pests. Um, and so the first category we're going to go to is native. So native species, like the blueberry, are native species or native organisms, which means any plant, animal, or even a fungi or bacteria whose presence is in an ecosystem is the result of only natural processes and is not in any way, shape, or form the result of human intervention. So anyone who, so the native blueberry is blueberries are native, but then also we've got wild turkeys in America, and then of course in Florida we have alligators as another example of some native animals. And then the next up is introduced, and as the word suggests, introduced species are organisms that originate in one region but are introduced to another region where they then become acclimated and established in that new area. So establishment means the organism can survive and reproduce on its own, which allows it to maintain a stable population in that new area. And usually humans are the source of this introduction, and that introduction can be accidental or it can be intentional. And it's important to point out that introduced species can have either beneficial or detrimental effects on the environment, and people for that matter. So peaches and honeybees are an example of introduced species that are considered to be beneficial. And honeybees are really beneficial because they were introduced from Europe, but they have all these, they pollinate everything, including those blueberries on the last slide. And so a lot of crops and the food that we eat actually relies on honeybees to pollinate them. Okay, so now up next is the invasive. And the National Invasive Species Council defines invasive species as being not native to the ecosystem, so that means they're introduced, and whose introduction will likely cause harm. That harm could cause negative impacts on the environment, economic loss, or sometimes they can even pose a risk to human health. So there's a distinction between introduced species and invasive species, and that's it. So introduced species don't always cause harm, but if it does, then it's an invasive species. So this means introduced species are not always invasive, but invasive species are always introduced. And just like introduced species, invasive species are usually introduced by people, and usually it's accidental because people don't purposely want to introduce something negative. But yeah, and so normally they hitch a ride through shipping of goods or moving from people, movement of people from country to country. But then sometimes they are intentionally introduced, and that's usually because people don't realize that what they're releasing could have such a negative impact. And one example of this intentional release is actually the giant African land snail in the middle. In 1966, a boy went and visited Hawaii, and he smuggled back 3 snails with him. And then he went to visit his grandmother's house in Miami and let him go in the garden. And, the snails really liked that garden, and they made a lot more snails. And so a whole eradication effort had to be done by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And the eradication effort took 10 years, over $1 million, and they had to remove close to 20,000 snails. So sometimes they do get released intentionally and can cause some problems. And one last definition, if you saw the title slide, the title of this talk is Pests and Pathways. And we have to go over exactly what a pest is. And so a pest is an organism that competes with humans for resources we value. This could be, consuming or damaging food, fiber, other materials intended for human consumption. And, you know, uh, those giant African land snails, they eat a tremendous number of different plants. But sometimes they will even eat the stucco and plaster on the side of buildings because they have lots of calcium and they need calcium to build that big old shell that they have. Um, so that's an example of a pest. And it's the pests can either be invasive or they can be native. So it's independent of invasive or native. And you can see this example here. We're looking at two different forestry pests. On the left is the southern pine beetle. And that's a native species that will attack pine trees. But then we have on the right the emerald ash borer. And that's an introduced species or invasive species, and that attacks ash trees. And even though they're both pests because they both are competing with humans for a resource that we value. Okay, so now that we are all on the same page for the different vocabulary, now we can get to the fun part and finally answer how are new species introduced and why does it seem like so many come here to Florida? So if you have any ideas for how new species get to Florida, and why they seem to like Florida so much once they get here, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, and we're gonna go through them one by one. So first, we're gonna talk about how they actually arrive here, and we said already that a lot of times invasive or introduced species are introduced by people. And so, how do people get here? Well, one way that people get to Florida is through air travel. And, Florida's got a lot of airports. And then if you look at Tampa Bay, we've got a lot of airports just in our little Bay Area. So there's just a lot of people coming in from all over. That's domestic and also international flights. And just more people means the more chance that one of them is going to pack a pest with them. But another interesting thing about the airports is that they bring in a lot of people in and out, but they also are moving goods as well. And one of those goods are flowers. And we're going to focus mainly on the plant side of things since we're talking about plant pests in this workshop. And with flowers, that's living plant material. And so that's an area where plant pests can hide out, and there's live plant material. So they can be packaged and shipped with that. And interestingly, Miami International Airport actually gets 88% of the flower imports into the US. So that's just a lot of different plant material coming into Miami, into Florida. And that's in addition to fruits and vegetables. So again, Miami is a huge, like the airport there is just a huge importer. It's just a huge hub because it also is going to take in 55% of the country's fruits and vegetable imports, which is just more plant material for those pests to hide out in and, act as a little stowaway until they get here to Florida. And then, we live in Florida, so we live on a peninsula, and that means lots of beaches, and that means a lot of ports too. So we've got 14 deep water ports, and again, the Tampa Bay area's got a bunch of ports within it as well. And there's just a lot of material coming in through these ports, and not all pests are going to be on live plant material per se. And an example of this is the Asian longhorn beetle shown in the left. And this is a wood-boring beetle that's actually going to bore into pallets in shipping material. So we're not actually concerned about inspecting the commodity for the Asian longhorn beetle, but we're interested in inspecting the pallets that are being used to ship that commodity. And you can see here, there's an inspector looking at the different pallets, and he's looking for the damage in the right-hand corner to see if there's evidence that the Asian longhorn beetle might be in there. And this is originally, it's believed to be the method that the pathway that the Asian longhorn beetle took to arrive here in the U.S. And lastly, we kind of covered some more international routes, but we're also connected to the continental U.S. And there's just a lot of trucking that goes on. And part of that is because we live in Florida, the third most populous state in the country. And so there's a lot of people, and those people are going to need, they're going to need food, they're going to want ornamental plants, they're going to want forestry products. And those products, a lot of time, are going to originate in a different part of the US. And they're going to be brought in to Florida on the trucks. And when they do that, CAPS program actually has these interdiction stations where they're going to stop the trucks and inspect the material that's passing through. And they're looking for pests and making sure that different insects aren't being brought in. And two of the ones that they're looking for are the brown marmorated stink bug, which is actually established here in Lake County in Florida, but it's been intercepted multiple times at each different interdiction station. And then we're also looking for the Bagrata bug, and the Bagrata bug is important because it's would be a huge pest to growers in Florida that are growing broccoli or cabbage or any of those cold crops like that. And interestingly, if you ever know someone from up north that's moving down, they're bringing their house plants, they're bringing anything else, they're actually, if they're bringing in plants from out of state, they're supposed to stop at these interdiction stations and get it inspected so that they can be sure not to be bringing in a pest that maybe in the northern part of the US, but isn't here in Florida, and we don't want it here in Florida. Okay, so we went over how they get here, and why we may have so many arrive, but it does seem like they kind of stick around when they get here, right? And so one of the reasons that there's just when a pest gets brought into Florida, they seem to kind of like it, and that's because of the same reasons that a lot of people decide to stick around. And it's the climate here is just really suitable for many different types of organisms, especially invasive ones. And our climate allows for an extended growing season, and for those pests that are going to be eating plants, that means more food for a longer period of time. And in addition to that, a lot of parts of Florida won't actually get a hard freeze, and so that means that those organisms are that would normally be knocked back or killed by that freeze. The freeze doesn't happen, so that they just never quite die off from that. And lastly, there's just a lot of stuff being brought into Florida, and that's through the airports, the deep water ports, interstate travel. And interstate travel can also include people who are just coming into the state to visit. And, if you think about anybody who wants to get to those Pinellas County beaches, they're going to probably pass through Pasco to get here. And those brown marmorated stink bugs have actually been found just to hitchhike on ordinary people's cars, and then they're just whenever they get where they want to go, they just kind of drop off and then hang out. And so with the huge tourism industry, it's another contributing factor of invasive pests and pathogens maybe being brought into the state. And thank you guys, and let me know if you have any questions.
Have we got everybody back? All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I think everybody's back. So as a reminder, as you look at this PowerPoint, Here I am not Taylor Smith. I'm Whitney Elmore. So this is Taylor Smith's PowerPoint. She's from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in the Division of Plant Industry. And so they get in lots of samples, as does the plant disease clinic up on campus in Gainesville and your local extension office. Lots of questions, lots of samples dealing with palm diseases. And so, with palms throughout the state, there are many different ones, very, very few, in fact, that are native to Florida. So we're pushing some of these palms out of their comfort zones. But in terms of diseases, there are quite a few that have had some pretty significant, not just ornamental, but definitely economic significance, that tend to come in very frequently in terms of sampling. And we wanted to go over some of those more common ones and more important diseases that you'll find in palms. So let me, if my presentation will go here. Okay, so we've got a variety of issues in palms. Sometimes it's definitely cultural, in terms of how people are trying to take care of palms and doing that incorrectly. I mean, a lot of people are not native to Florida, or maybe haven't taken care of a lot of their own landscape and they really don't know how to care for their palms. So there are some cultural issues and definitely some abiotic or non-living problems, that can show up sometimes and be really confusing. They can look like they're caused by a fungus or caused by bacteria or caused by an insect. So sometimes it can be kind of hard to differentiate between some of those cultural things out there that are affecting our palms and something that's actually alive and doing damage in some way. So from an abiotic standpoint, cold damage can be really a critical issue. We'll take a little bit of a look at that. Definitely nutrition deficiencies. Our pH tends to be very high, especially across Central Florida. That locks up the nutrients, even if they are there in the soil and the palm can't take it up, and they're going to show some nutritional deficiencies. Those can look very similar to diseases, especially common diseases caused by fungi like fusarium wilt, Ganoderma butt rot, Phalaenopsis trunk rot. So if you notice here, there are hints as to what part of the plant is being affected, at least initially: the trunk, the bud, Phytophthora bud rot, and then a whole host of leaf spot diseases that are caused by a variety of fungi that, for the most part, tend to not be very significant, can be somewhat superficial in most all cases, while others of these are fatal diseases and relatively common in some areas. We also do have two very important phytoplasmas. Now, phytoplasmas are a little bit different. They're kind of like a fungus, kind of like a bacterium, somewhere in between, in the way that they live their lives and affect plants. But there are two: lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing. That's also called Texas Phoenix palm decline. And so we're going to go over these a little bit more in detail here. So with fusarium wilt, there really are two subspecies of fusarium that can cause infections in palms. Basically, they're both going to be taken up by the roots for the most part, and they're going to block the water flow. If you don't get water coming from the roots up through the tissue of the plant, you can imagine then that the plant's going to suffer greatly, and usually are killed pretty fast. It can be a pretty quick turnaround when fusarium starts. I mean, it's kind of like a heart attack there for the plant. It's not moving any water up through the vascular tissue. So we have one, fusarium wilt in queen palm and Mexican palm, which are very common palms, especially in Central Florida. There is another fusarium wilt of Canary Island date palm. And so you can imagine some of these tend to be pretty expensive palms too. So from an ornamental standpoint, people planting them in their landscape are investing quite a bit of money. And at the same time, you do have nursery growers that are trying to grow these for sale, and they're investing quite a bit of money. So a lot of value on the line here. Plus, with fusarium, once we have an issue in one palm in an area, it can very quickly spread to others in the adjacent areas very, very fast. Typically, what you're going to find is the symptoms are going to show up on the oldest leaves first. So those are going to be the lowest in the canopy of your palms, and then it's going to start to progress upwards. And again, depending on the time of the year, especially in the summer, you'll start to see these when they're under a little bit more stress from the super high heat. And it can take a month, maybe 2 months, that these plants will go downhill very, very quickly. But the progression is always the same. You're going to have those lower fronds that start to suffer first. Um, and if you notice with fusarium, very indicative, really no other disease or nutritional deficiency causes this on the rachis of the plant. Okay, here in number 2, if you look really, really close here, you can see this brown defining line here. And if you take a little bit closer picture in number 3, another view right down the middle, right there of that rachis, you can see this brown decaying tissue and see how the leaflets are dying on that side compared to the other side that looks relatively healthy and green, at least initially. This is kind of a mid stage when you'll start to notice these types of patterns on the fronds. Very indicative of fusarium wilt. And is there anything you can do when this starts? Absolutely not. The damage is done at this point. But when you see kind of this half and half, half good looking tissue early on, bad, dead looking tissue on the same part of the plant like that, that tells you you're dealing with some type of vascular problem. So it's a very one-sided, at least early on in the disease stages, a one-sided set of symptoms. But you'll see that reddish brown line there down that petiole. And in the fourth picture there, what you're seeing is in a laboratory. If you suspected that you had fusarium and you wanted to be certain of it, the palm's going to die, honestly, either way. But if you wanted to be certain, you could send a plant disease sample to the plant disease clinic in Gainesville, and your extension office can help you with that sample and give you information on how to take that. It's a little bit complicated sometimes, but what you're seeing there is an auger plate where the fusarium is being grown out of the tissue to positively identify the organism, in this case, this fungus fusarium, that is the causal agent of the disease. Relatively common, especially throughout Central Florida. I see it with some frequency coming into my office. Ganoderma butt rot is another one of those eventually fatal diseases. This one tends to take a little bit of time, though, in most cases for the palm to decline. And by the time you see kind of the outward appearance of the fungus, which you see there in number 3, that's a basidiocarp. That's a reproductive structure of the fungus literally growing out of the diseased palm tissue. By the time you see this, it's absolutely done deal. It's going downhill, probably dead or very close to being dead at this point in time, where the fungus has just inhabited and infected and colonized the whole plant or a good portion of it and is using it as a food source. This is a lethal disease of these palms, and a wide variety will get it. I see it very, very commonly on our uh, native sable palm. It's quite common on those, but all of our palms are considered hosts of this disease. The first thing that you're going to really notice well before you would see these basidiocarps growing out is those lower fronds. If you notice there in the picture in number 2, the lower fronds start to just wilt and drop and brown. And it's not just one or two like a normal frond as it ages and it dies over time. This is a very rapid progression. It doesn't really go through that yellowing phase of that slow death that is normal on a frond as it ages. It goes very, very quickly over to just brown, almost a coppery color, and just drops. That's a very distinctive symptom in the earlier stages. And then up there in that top picture, number 1, you can see a little bit more advanced disease there in those lower fronds where they're already getting over into that coppery stage. But very distinctive. If you see that number 3, that basidiocarp, it's a mushroom growing out of the palm, especially at the base of the palm. You're guaranteed that that's caused by Ganoderma. That's the fungus that causes butt rot. So you can imagine the butt rot down at the base of the plant is usually where we see the plant collapsing very quickly. So just to give you an idea, again, palms are unusual. They're not really trees. Palms are like giant grasses. The growing point of the palm or the newest tissue is going to be right there at the bud. So you see that growing point that's circled there, right kind of at the base of the fronds, if you will. And then above that, kind of out of the middle, is that nice tall spear leaf, that newest leaf that's starting to emerge. A lot of times we will see the very earliest symptom that something is going wrong from a disease standpoint in palms is that spear leaf will come out and not unfold, or it will come out and quickly just droop and collapse. That's pretty hard when you've got palms that are many, many, many feet tall. It can be very difficult to see that in its earliest stages, even in some cases when there were perhaps some opportunities to maybe help the situation. But typically, by the time you see that spear leaf up and drooping, or it's just collapsed and not unfolded, you've got a significant issue at that point. And if that bud, that growing point dies in a palm, the whole thing is dead. There are no other growing points left on a palm. So it's basically like a tall corn plant or a grass plant, but not a tree. And their vascular tissue, the tissue that moves the nutrients and the water up and down the stem, is very, very different. So the way that disease symptoms sometimes manifest themselves looks to be quite a bit different compared to trees. So it's kind of comparing apples to oranges when you look at symptoms sometimes in those cases. So the Labiopsis trunk rot of the palm and the trunk, so the midsection of the stem, basically between the butt, like we were talking, or the base and that bud, is where this disease is going to do the majority of the damage early on. I do see this one with some regularity, not as common as Ganoderma or Fusarium, but all of our palms are host to the disease. I do see it anecdotally more often in queen palms, to be honest with you. And basically what happens is the middle, that trunk will just start to rot away. And typically you don't really notice it until it's in an advanced stage. And you will see in number one where the trunk will collapse. And so the top portion, usually about the top third of the plant, will just collapse down onto itself. And obviously this does not look normal for our palms. In number two, you can see a very significant deformation there where it literally collapses, and it's basically overnight. When it goes, it goes. The inside of these palms is incredibly fibrous, not woody, but fibrous. And so, it's got a lot of strength to it, but there's a point where enough damage or rotting has taken place that it just can't take anymore and it collapses on its own weight. The third picture you see there, and this is more common in South Florida, like in the few coconut palms that are left, you might see some stem bleeding to where it's literally oozing fungal spores. And that's what you see in that next picture there under a microscope. It's oozing fungal spores and rot basically out of the stem. And this stinks. It stinks to high heaven, and so does Ganoderma butt rot in its later stages. But I have seen some of these palms on the brink of collapse at this point, and you could literally poke your finger straight through the stem, and it's gooey and it's a mess. Okay, but again, they'll take that tissue there, that darkening tissue, that rotting tissue, they'll take it to a laboratory in a sample, and they will try to grow out that causal organism to be absolutely certain that that's what we're dealing with, because there are situations to where we have new invasive pests that enter into Florida, especially a lot of these diseases can be blown in by hurricanes, can be brought in by that tissue and flowers and plants, those ornamentals that Shannon was mentioning earlier. Sometimes even insects can harbor and vector in many of our diseases in all of our plants, actually. So, it's important to sometimes actually culture these things out and not just think, I think it's probably this or probably that based on symptoms, because we may actually be dealing with something new and potentially more invasive and destructive. So sampling and tracing of these kinds of things is very important. You do have Phytophthora bud rot, so the bud of the plant is actually collapsing. And you can see some of the earliest stages there in number 1, that spear leaf is starting to struggle and turn brown. In number 2, you can see where the bud is basically just dying. That doesn't look normal, right? It's just dying and starting to drop off at this point in time. And again, all of our palms are host, not incredibly common in our area, but you will have that discoloration, wilting of the spear leaf. Again, that's hard to see. But that is typically the first symptom in a palm problem. If the spear leaf is going, it's done. Game is pretty much over at this point in time. But that rot will continue. And again, this is something that stinks very bad. You can imagine any kind of rot usually doesn't have a very good smell. But again, we need lab diagnosis for this. And you can see the spores up there in the top. These are actually swimming spores of Phytophthora. They will swim around. So a lot of free water, free moisture will move these things around. And in Florida, we got plenty of moisture, at least through part of the year. Graphiola. Graphiola is a really common leaf spot fungus on our palms across most of Florida, but our Phoenix palms especially, this is very common, but you'll see it on a variety of them. Usually it's superficial and not generally leading to a significant problem in the plant, but you will see this on the oldest leaves first. And you will notice these thread-like structures that emerge from the reproductive tissue. You can see those there in the second picture. So that's a blown up picture of some of those dark black spots where the spores are actually being released back out into the environment. And those thread-like structures can make it look like the leaves, the leaflets are almost like they've just been abraded almost. So it's very unusual, kind of frizzly type of appearance, but relatively common on palms. We also have a variety of other fungi like Bipolaris, Cindricaladium, Extrahyalum, Pestilosa, all of these that have the ability to cause leaf spots. Again, really, really common, but this is where especially we start to look at this and go, is that actually a disease? It kind of looks like maybe a nutrient problem because they can look incredibly similar. The only way to be absolutely sure is to send a sample to the plant disease clinic, but it does help us to know what we're dealing with and these things as they're moving around, because they can do quite a bit of damage from an economic standpoint on plants that we're trying to grow and trying to sell. And most people don't want the plants to look like this at the same time out in the environment. Now, perhaps the most destructive of the palm diseases in Florida has been TPPD, or Texas Phoenix palm decline, also called lethal yellowing. This is pretty significant, and I see this every day, all day. Everywhere I go, I see plants that are dying and dead because of this particular organism. This is one of those that's caused by the phytoplasmas, some of those weird bacterial-like organisms, incredibly, incredibly tiny organisms and hard to diagnose, but we do have some diagnostic tests. It requires that we drill into the trunk of the tree in a particular way, and again, extension office can help guide this, and that sample is sent to the plant disease clinic. In its very earliest stages, there might be some things that we could do to this, but it is almost impossible to catch very early on. And again, it can be a couple months typically to where we really start to see symptoms, and it will progress very rapidly. And usually 4 or 5 months at the most, these palms will be dead. And it's significant. Early symptoms: fruit drop. The lower canopy leaves, you can see that picture up there in the top box, start to drop off and die. You can see that in that second photo down. At the same time, the inflorescence, you see that in picture 3 there, will die. And the final stage here is that spear leaf. Spear leaf will lodge and fall over. And so oftentimes this does look like something like Ganoderma butt rot, Fusarium, even though if you look really closely, you'll notice that it doesn't have that defining dark brown line down half of the petiole. But it can be confused with it. The only way to know for sure is a diagnostic test, a molecular test. So it's a pretty advanced test with that trunk sampling to be certain. And the best reason to do that test is not necessarily to save that palm, but to save others in the area. So this is vectored or spread by an insect, and those insects are prolific and they move around very, very quickly, these leaf hoppers. So they'll pick it up from one and carry it to the next. So, you know, the best chance we have at protecting the others in that area is to try to come in and do a sample to make sure what we're dealing with is actually this particular causal organism. Now, again, there are those abiotic factors that are very easily confused, especially in palms with diseases. So abiotic is caused by something non-living. And the most common non-living problems or cultural issues that we see, sometimes we can control and sometimes we can't, in palms would be cold damage and the nutritional issues. So again, the cold damage, it really does depend from one species to the next, and palms grow very slowly, very slowly. So you may have damage, cold damage in one winter season on your palms, and you not actually see the symptoms of that for 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. And some of those symptoms you'll see down there in number 3, that's stem cracking. That's where you had kind of an internal decay. I see this one quite a lot where people have sprinklers on and they have them turned straight at the stem. They don't turn that off and they don't realize that once these plants are established, like any of our trees and shrubs, they don't need supplemental irrigation unless we enter an extreme, extreme drought. But they will point those sprinklers right at that area, and you can see in that third picture exactly where the sprinkler was hitting. That freezes overnight in the winter, and that does damage and will then do an internal rot, a slow rot over time. It may or may not kill it, but it certainly is not going to look too good, and it's going to be very susceptible to actual diseases at that point. But usually you'll see if you look there in number 2, number 1, you will see usually the bud where that apical meristem is, or that growing point, is usually not killed in most cases, but it can be damaged to some extent. And again, it can, because it's damaged, make it more susceptible to infections from things like fungi and bacteria that can actually kill that living tissue, that growth point at some point in the line, but it usually is slow over time. But you will notice discoloration, yellowing, and especially necrosis on those older leaves. They're more sensitive. The older leaves have less nutritional component to them compared to the newer upper leaves in the canopy on palms, so they're going to be more susceptible to cold damage. But if you look at that number 2, that photo right there in the middle, that looks incredibly similar to something like potassium deficiency. Now, if you're used to looking at this all the time, you'd be able to tell the difference. But in this case, I mean, I can tell the difference because I see it with some frequency, but most folks, most homeowners and whatnot would not be able to tell the difference. And you can imagine the damage they would do if they ran out there trying to fertilize this palm, especially when it's super, super stressed right now. And what you do when you fertilize is you tell it to grow. And that's not what we want it to do right now. And they might actually do quite a bit of harm from an environmental standpoint, putting out a fertilizer that's not going to go anywhere and not do anything but leach into waterways and become a pollutant. So it really does help us. It behooves the environment. It behooves our pocketbooks and our plants to know exactly what we're dealing with before we start putting anything out into the environment. Same when it comes to thinking this might be a disease. Somebody might go out there and try to apply a fungicide. They might think it's insect, try to apply a pesticide, and it's not. So they're putting these things out needlessly into the environment. So it's really important to actually understand more of what we're dealing with, but certainly try to get to the experts that can help us. Your local extension office is your first step in that journey. And then manganese deficiency, really, really common. You're going to get some really odd symptoms, especially in queen palms. You see over here on the far left, look at how stunted those fronds are coming out. And we usually call this frizzle top. If you look at the other pictures there, I think you'll see why. The leaflets themselves just frizzle down on the tips and die. Incredibly common, and this is because the pH is too high. And so there are things that you can do to temporarily lower the pH, and by lowering the pH of the soil, you allow the plant to be able to take up the nutrients that exist, either not needing fertilization or after you fertilized. Again, extension office is your first stop on figuring these things out. Boron deficiency does really weird things, especially in palms. You will have, if you notice here, in number 1, the leaflet tips will just bend and it almost looks like a Z at the end instead of long and straight and flat. Very classic boron deficiency. In number 2, you have this inverted V, that truncation where the frond comes out and it just starts to grow straight down, an inverted V. And you'll also see that over there in number 4 in the new leaves growing out. They'll grow out and grow downward. And then the trunk will literally bend like you see there in number 3. So significant deficiencies. And what you have to remember is the growth is so slow in palms. Even when you do correct the pH or correct the nutritional deficiency through fertilization, those older leaves are going to continue to show that deficiency. They'll never really get better. It's the new leaves that we're looking at that we're hoping for better growth to come out of them, and that takes some time. So you have to spend some time with your plants. Again, usually, if you're looking at these symptoms, they look pretty dramatic, and you can think, my gosh, this is definitely disease or potentially insect here, when this is completely cultural. This is nutritional. And potassium, like I mentioned a minute ago, very common, especially in Pasco County over along the coast where our pH is somewhere around an 8 instead of down around a 6.5, which is really a good area for the palms to be able to take up the nutrients. Again, those older leaves first, and they look rough. They look really rough on the ends. This is not pretty. And if you notice in that top picture up there, the spots, it doesn't really look like a leaf spot caused by a fungus, because the middle where it's yellowing out and chlorotic is not really necrotic and dying, at least early on. It's literally kind of translucent. You can almost see through it. Classic potassium symptoms there. But then eventually, if you see there in number 4, it will lead to dead spots that will become necrotic and start to kind of fall out of the middle of that leaflet there. Very common, but it can be corrected, at least in the new tissue. So again, palm diseases are really, really hard to diagnose in the field. It usually takes an expert coming into the extension office where we know to look for specific symptoms, and then may include needing advanced laboratory techniques, either growing it out in auger or molecular techniques to have a definitive diagnosis. And typically that diagnosis is basically to help protect the other palms in that particular area. Palms go really, really slow. So anytime they're injured, anytime we're having to correct nutritional deficiencies, it's going to take a long time for us to see results, to know that the treatment is working at the same time. So again, extension office is your first stop when it comes to palm diseases, and we can help you take it from there. Okay. Hope you enjoyed it. If you got any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
I have one. So some of these diseases and stuff with the palm trees are contagious to the other palm trees. And so if you see something happening, you probably want to try and check it out.
Yes, absolutely. With your palms, I mean, some people, some of the palms, people, really don't care that much, or they've not invested a tremendous amount. But if you're a grower, if you've got them around your home, in your landscape, I mean, some palms could definitely be a structural hazard. Could be an animal, a human hazard if those were to fall at some point. And I mean, especially if they're up around the house, and you get high winds from hurricanes coming through and it's dead or dying, you don't want that going down on the house. I mean, these are incredibly heavy plants, but the diseases that I've shown here are all contagious, quote unquote.
Okay.
Either being able to move around in the wind, being vectored by insects, even just in the soil because of the movement of water being so pervasive through our soils. So, you know, it does behoove you to check it out if you have lost one or have one going downhill and you have others in the proximity.
If we have a lot of palms that are down here in the wood, in our wooded areas, they're cabbage type palms, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Are they fairly resistant to most of these problems, or?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, overall, the sable palms are very resilient palms compared to the others because they're native. But when you've got invasive pests that come in, fungi, the phytoplasms, any of this kind of stuff, they're going to be more susceptible than normal. They're typically, I will say, more resilient to the things that are also indigenous along with them that have co-evolved with them in this particular environment. But all the things that I showed on here, the cabbage palms are susceptible to them.
Okay. Thank you. Very, very nice presentation.
So if you have a couple of acres that has, say, 100 palms on it, if one of them shows these symptoms, is there a good chance that all of them are going to have that?
No, not necessarily. So if you're talking about diseases, here's a real good thing. Disease is not the norm. Okay. So typically, if you're seeing problems in any kind of plant, it's normally going to be a cultural issue first. So something either you've done wrong or something that you not necessarily can't control, at least easily in the environment. Sometimes it's moisture, sometimes it's heat, you know, drought, cold. There are things that you can't control, pH, soil texture, compaction, all those kinds of things. You can help alleviate some of those, but you can't always control it. So because disease is not that common and because it's going to be moving around at random for the most part, you're not going to have typically every one of the same plant wiped out in an area. The closer they are to each other, the higher the chance, those kinds of things. If it's insect vectored, if it's moved around easily in the wind, higher the chance it's going to move around. But not every single one. If you had one out there infected and you had 100 of the same species of palms, you're probably not going to lose them all. But depending on the disease, you could lose a good amount.
Okay.
So it kind of depends on, you know, are you willing to take the risk or not? But what I always tell folks, even if they don't want to go through the time and the expense, which it's very affordable, $40 for a sample to go to the plant disease clinic. If they don't want to go that route and they have palms in the area that they're concerned about, relatively close, or the neighbor's got an issue and you're concerned over here, getting rid of that diseased palm and getting rid of it appropriately and as quick as possible is incredibly important. That's going to definitely slow the likelihood of spread. So, you know, when I say removing it, I don't mean just taking a chainsaw and cutting it down and leaving it, because that becomes an inoculum source for it to spread to others. So you have to take it down, burn it, or get it out in the safest way possible.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Welcome.
If you do have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and we can answer them through there. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk about the let me get my screen figured out here. I'm going to be talking about some insect issues that could face our palms here in Florida, and then also a couple of invasive species that are here or that aren't here and we don't want them here. Okay, so you can see my screen. And Sarah did a great job of introducing weevils. And so just to kind of retouch on that subject, beetles are known for that elongated snout called a rostrum. They also have that elbowed antenna, and they have the chewing mouth parts all the way at the end of that snout. And then they also, like all beetles, have those hardened elytra. And Weevils is a pretty diverse group, and they've got close to 100,000 species, and they have a bunch of different types of habitats that they can live in, a bunch of different types of food they can eat. And so some of the damages that weevils can cause are they can chew on those plant leaves just like they did in Build-A-Bug, or that apple. Oh, I think someone needs to mute. I'm getting some feedback. However, for those species, there are also grain pests that will can be stored, grain pests in your grain, your wheat, your cereals, and a lot of times weevils will sometimes be inside the plant that they're eating, which can make it really difficult to find them since they're on the inside, and you don't normally look inside a plant that often, and if you do, it's going to be causing some damage. And for today, for this presentation, we're going to be talking about palm weevils, again with the palm theme, and we're going to be talking about three main ones. We have the native palmetto weevil, and then we've got two invasive species that are not currently in Florida, but we're always are on the lookout for these species, because if they ever do get here, we'd rather know sooner than later. So first, we'll just go through these one by one, starting with the native palmetto weevil. So it's native in Florida and the southeastern U.S. It can reach sizes up to 1¼ inches. So it's actually the largest weevil in North America. And what's pretty cool is, as you can see in these photos, the adult weevils they vary greatly in the different colorations. So sometimes they'll be completely black, and other times they'll be red with like black dots or cool patterns. And sometimes you can even see this variation in the same grouping. And actually, I think me and Sarah were collecting for our entomology class and found a group of these palmetto weevils. And we thought it was so cool because there was some that were all black, and then others that have different red patterns on them, all found on that same fallen tree that they were around. And so the interesting thing about the palmetto weevil is it's most associated with the sable palm, or the cabbage palm that we were just talking about. And, it's probably due to the coevolution. Both of them are native palms. So they've both been around each other. And that cabbage palm is actually the state tree of Florida. But normally palmetto weevils are restricted to stressed palms. So this could be wounded or dying palms, but also palms that are like newly planted in a landscape. They're under a lot of stress too. But normally you wouldn't think that they're too much of a concern for like a healthy sable palm. However, it's a slightly different story when it comes to those non-native palm species, and they have been found to cause damage to healthy Canary Island date palms and Bismarck palms, along with a couple other species. And so most of the damage caused by the palmetto weevil is actually caused by the larva feeding inside that trunk. And you can see what that damage looks like in this middle photo here. And because they're inside, again, they're very hard to detect because you don't usually look inside the trunk very often. And symptoms can vary, but generally they include an irreversible decline of the younger leaves. And palm species with upright leaves, such as the Canary Island date palm, they'll show like early symptoms in the older leaves, which will droop and then they'll collapse. And eventually damage can get so bad that it causes pop neck, which is similar to that, what Whitney was talking about earlier, where the neck of the palm actually collapses over. And you can see that in this left photo. And after that, the palm's kind of done for. Like I said, palmetto weevil, it's native to the U.S., so you can find them all the way from South Carolina, Texas, all around Florida, and they're even in the Bahamas too. And then, let's see. And so this is a typical palm weevil life cycle. And the interesting thing about this is that the palmetto weevil is attracted to stressed palms because stressed palms actually emit like a volatile odor. So the weevils actually can detect this, and then they'll be attracted to that. And then when one weevil finds that new like that good tree that they like, it's not good for the tree, but it's good for them. They actually will release hormones that are going to attract even more palmetto weevils, and then they'll mate and start laying eggs, and then that's where the life cycle either starts or ends. And so eggs will turn into larvae. The larvae will eat all through that inside of that palm. So they're just kind of eating machines. And then once they get full and once they're mature, they're going to go ahead and make a cocoon. And then they're going to pupate inside that cocoon. And eventually, after a few weeks, they'll emerge as adults and then try and find a stressed palm again. And so when it comes to like managing palmetto weevil, prevention is key. And that's because there aren't really a lot of options after an infestation has been detected. Bucket traps have been used for monitoring, and they can use either freshly cut palm tissue or pheromones that will attract those palm weevils. And one of the biggest prevention methods is just to keep the palms happy and healthy. And that means proper fertilization, proper irrigation, and anything that's going to promote your plant health and vigor. And secondly, pruning and wounding of trees should be avoided because that's a stressor too. And similar to a lot of the diseases, is once an infestation's detected, the recommended course of action is just to cut down and destroy the infested palms before the adults can emerge and then lead to more diseases on other trees, or not diseases, but more infestations, I should say. Okay, so that was the native palm. Now we're going to get into palm weevils. Now we're going to get into the invasive ones, starting with the red palm weevil. Sarah or Whitney, can you mute whoever? I'm not sure. Someone's unmuted. I keep getting feedback. Okay, so the first invasive species is the red palm weevil, which is native to southeastern Asia. And it's considered to be one of the most damaging insect pests of palms in the world. So this is a huge concern for nursery production of palm, which is a huge industry in Florida and in the U.S. with a $200 million industry. And then it's also a concern because it's environmental concern because it could outcompete our native palmetto weevils, and that it also can be damaging to trees and native ecosystems, and also that includes a couple of endangered species of palms that they could potentially affect. And of course, palms in the landscapes and in cities and homes. And just like the palmetto weevil, there's a lot of different color combinations here. You can be jet black or all the way to some red with a couple of black dots on them. So you really can't rely on color and pattern alone, just because there's so much variation in this species. The red palm weevil has a bunch of different hosts, and that includes the Canary Island date palm, coconut palm, sago palms, bunch of others, long list. Just it likes palms. And then we have a couple different types of damage, and again, they're inside the tissue, so it's kind of hard to detect. You probably won't see this in the left, and you probably won't see this either unless you're looking for it. But you will see damage from fronds when they emerge, and then late stage, you're going to see, like, again, drooping in the leaves. And so it's currently not in the U.S., but we have sampled for it in Florida, Texas, California, a couple other states, and we haven't found any red palm weevils, which is good. But it has been recently, or kind of recently, in 2009, it was first found in this hemisphere. So it's not even native to the Americas, but it was found in the Caribbean in 2009. So it's kind of a little close to home if we think about how close the Caribbean islands are and how many hurricanes come through the Caribbean and then up into Florida. But mostly the red palm weevil is going to be in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. It's a very similar life cycle. So it's going to start off eggs, move to larva, then pupate, and then into adults. And an interesting, a fun fact is, does anybody think that this grub here looks very tasty? Like, if you would you want to like put it in maybe a stir fry it or saute it in a pan? Because one of the pathways that I didn't mention earlier is actually people will eat these larvae as delicacies. And so that's another route. If people are shipping in these larvae, if they're alive, they could potentially get out and then establish, and that would be another way of introduction. And I don't know, doesn't sound very tasty to me, but everybody has different tastes. So, and again, very similar. Prevention and control is key, because once it gets out of hand, there's not a whole lot you can do. There are some systemic insecticides, but that's usually costs quite a bit of money. And then sometimes there'll be you use mass trapping to reduce the number, and you use the pheromones to trap and attract those weevils as well. But honestly, the best way and preferred method is just to keep it out and to not let it into Florida or the United States. And that's the best control method. Okay, so last weevil is going to be the South American palm weevil. And the South American palm weevil, it's native to Central America, South America, Mexico. So it's in this hemisphere, unlike the red palm weevil. And the other really important feature with the South American palm weevil is that it can vector a nematode, so a plant parasitic nematode that can actually cause a disease in palms. And again, all these weevils are going to have similar host ranges, and that's the Canary Islands date palm, sago palm, and then the two invasive species can actually use sugarcane as a host, and that's a very important crop in South Florida, so that might also be an issue of concern. And then we've got similar symptoms. So they involve progressing yellowing of leaves, and then necrotic flowers, and then the emerging leaves will also die. And similar to some of the fungal diseases, these infested trees can actually emit an odor, which usually doesn't smell very good. And that can happen with the red palm weevils as well. And unique to the the South American palm weevil is the red ring disease. And so that's actually a nematode that hitches a ride on the weevil. So the weevil is going to enter into that tree and release the nematode. And the nematode is actually going to feed off that tree as well. And it's going to produce this red ring around the outside of the trunk, or it's on the inside of the trunk, but near the edge. And so that's not in Florida, and nematodes are really hard to control, so we don't want that here either. And it's unlike the red palm weevil, the South American palm weevil has been intercepted or detected. So it has been found in those yellow states, so California, Arizona, and Texas. It's not established there, but that means that they may have found one or two or a couple but there isn't like a population that is reproducing. But luckily, we haven't ever found one here in Florida, so that's good. Again, very similar life cycle. They're going to have an egg, a very chubby larva that some people will decide to eat, and then they make a cocoon, pupate, and then emerge as adults. Very similar methods with monitoring and managing. You're going to use these bucket traps. This is actually a homemade one out of a 5-gallon bucket and some burlap, and you're going to put some pheromones in there, and that'll attract the beetles, and the weevils will be able to crawl in, but then won't be able to get out. And so you can kind of figure out if there's going to be weevils in the area because of if you find them in your trap. And the main management is going to be phytosanitation, which means your plant material is being clean and free of any pests or diseases. So this is back to keeping out both the South American palm weevil, any other invasive palm weevils, and then also that red ring disease. And so this is if you import a palm that comes into the US and was palm weevil larvae in it, because they're inside, they're hard to detect, that is not phytosanitary. Phytosanitary would be a completely clean, healthy palm that's been inspected and should be free of any pests. And so that's a really key, prevention is key. So real quick, we're going to do a little side-by-side comparison between these 3 different weevils. And the best way to distinguish these species of giant palm weevils is to look at the shape of the pronotum. That pronotum is this round the plate right here. It's on their thorax. And if you look at the top part, which would be like their shoulders, this is their head, so it's the anterior, it's forward. You can see that our native palmetto weevil has like a really big, broad shoulders, whereas these invasive species actually just kind of slope downward. So that's one way you can tell. And then if you're going to look at the bottom, the other end of the pronotum, which is the posterior end, you can also look at the shape. So this palmetto weevil, the native one, actually has a very broad shape. It's kind of like a wide bowl, and so does the red palm weevil here too. But if you look at the South American palm weevil, it's much more rounded and kind of pointed or lobed. So I say that these are more like a bowl, while these are more like a cup kind of. And lastly, if you look down at the scutellum, which Sarah mentioned earlier, it's that triangle piece. It's kind of hard to see in these photos, but this is a blown up photo of in between the elytra right there. And you can see our native species, it tapers very sharply, whereas the invasive species is much more rounded and tapers it looks more like an arrowhead, whereas like this is just a really fine point. And then to get a little bit more in detail, you also can look at the rostrum. The males of the palmetto weevil won't have setae, which is these hairs. So the native species won't have that, whereas the invasive species will. And then if you want to get even more in detail, you can look at how many teeth they have. So palmetto weevil will have 1, whereas the red palm weevil will have a tridentate mandible, and then the South American palm weevil will have the just 2 bidentate. And you also could flip them over and look at the other side of their head. These are the antennae. And you can see here, this is a diagram just showing that these sutures where the different plates formed actually are, they're different in between these species, but very in-depth detail to look here. And with that, we're going to have well, you have to check the time, but did anybody have any questions?
Quick question. If we do discover that we've got weevils, hopefully the native kind, would that also be something to contact the Extension Service about?
I think Whitney might be the best person to answer that.
Let me jump back on here real quick where you can see me. Sure, you can always call us and we can help you with an identification on that. And if we can't, we will get the sample over to the specialist up on campus to be sure we have a positive identification. And we are happy to do that for you and kind of walk you through any kind of management guidelines. It's a good idea, when I have lots of people that on occasion will come into the office or send us a photo and be like, I thought you just might be interested. Sure, we're interested. It helps us to know kind of what's going on because we tend to see patterns sometimes seasonally too. So it definitely can help us. And on occasion, people think that, like in this case, oh, it's probably just a native or something like that, but it helps to be on the safe side when we're dealing with something that can be so incredibly destructive. So if you see something unusual, something new, something you're definitely not familiar with, you're more than welcome to send it in to us.
Great, thanks. I'm new to the Florida area, so about the only bug I recognized was the stink bug. Fortunately,
Okay. All right. So
don't
you
have
might,
nearly as many here as Georgia.
yeah, exactly. You might want to give us a call. We can talk you through because everything's kind of flipped on its head compared to a little bit further north down here. So give us a call. We can help you at the office.
Great, thanks, Whitney. This has been fun. It's my
Sure.
first Zoom thing.
Oh, well, good. Congratulations.
So tech savvy.
All right. So there's 3 main parts that we talked about. And then there's 2 others that you can find on this beetle. And these are just parts that are most recognizable. So does anyone have any guesses on what they're called and where they are? The important characteristics, at least.
Okay, I'm not going for the scientific stuff. It's the pointy thing in front that's the mouth, the thorax, I believe, and then the body.
So the thorax and then the body. So, yes. So we'll do the last 2 parts before I say what they're called. There's 2 more parts that we use to identify between weevils and just to identify weevils.
Oh, let's see. The Florida one has a straight one with a very straight ridge. The other ones have more fuzzies on the top, and I can't remember the third one.
Okay, so that's part of the of its snout. But we pointed out the snout is what we can see on like all weevils compared to other beetles. There's one more part near its snout that's important to weevils. And then one that's a little bit more tricky.
We matched a lot of them during Build-A-Bug. For the first one near the snout.
It'll be upside down on the belly. The Florida one is very straight angled. And the other ones have more curve, the little triangle shape.
Tammy, you're
yes.
killing it. Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah. I'm gonna say you're like 2 slides ahead of us where you're taking all the different ones.
I'm trying to think about all the different parts.
I thought you
and then
the whole bug.
And then the last part is its elbowed antennae. So we got its snout, its antennae. This part is its pronotum. This really tiny part that's really hard to see on this drawing, that's scutellum. And then yes, the body, the elytra. So these are all the parts. And the snout's also called the rostrum. I always just call it the snout. And this family in the beetle order is Curculionidae. So all weevils are in that family. All right, this is the important one. Let's hope we can remember this. So there's 2 invasive and 1 native. So which one is the native one?
Palmetto.
Yes, perfect. And then that leaves our invasive ones. And then they all are considered pests of economic importance. Just one you'll actually find in Florida. Hopefully we won't find the other two, because that would be even worse. So that one's pretty easy. Now this part is
Oh, where I
think
was?
yes. So hopefully you should be able to get this. So all the red arrows are gonna go to the same place on each weevil to compare them. So we just have to match. We just have to find the parts for red, yellow, and blue. So you can say roughly what area it is in, just because the names aren't as scientific for each part.
The red is the
Some of them are.
Behind the shoulders, lack of.
Yes, the shoulders. That's one.
And that triangle area below in the body.
Yep, the scutellum.
And you also talked about the mandibles had 1 or 2 or 3.
So that is true. For this part, that's not what the yellow arrow goes to, just because we don't have a close-up on the snout, but that is true. They have different setae on their snout.
pointed versus the rounded part that's on the
Yeah.
rod.
Rounded right here.
Yes.
Broad shouldered.
Yes, perfect. Let me just rotate all of these. Oops. Oh my goodness. Can't grab it. Okay. So yep, those are all the parts, and this is a much more detailed explanation. So the shoulders that we were calling them, that's called the anterior edge. So you can kind of tell how this one's more broad. It sticks out more. It's more square shaped, whereas these, they're kind of, it goes into a point more for these two. And then this part that separates the thorax and the abdomen, that's called the posterior edge. And that's what the yellow arrow is pointing to. It's a little hard to see because they're all darkly colored. But these two, again, they make it look more square, whereas this one points down more. And then that scutellum is much easier to see down here. And you can see how this one is more of a point. And then these, again, are more broad. So good job. And then the last thing is the damage of the weevils. So which one is late stage drooping? I should have added letters. So we'll just go from left to right, A, B, C, and D.
It'd be B.
Yep, this one would be B.
Red ring is C.
Mm-hmm.
A for the neck.
Yep. And then finally, oh, my lights turned off again. Let me finish this. The lights go off automatically in this room, so I have to move. Okay. So yep. So that late stage drooping and the pop neck. So those happen when so much damage happens in the trunk that the trees don't get nutrients, and then they end up just falling apart. And then the larval damage, so when all the larvae are actually eating and just burrowing through and stealing nutrients. And then the red ring disease is probably one of the more important ones, caused by the South American palm weevil. So a big concern is that either the South American palm weevil will be introduced to the United States, or it could be possible that the nematode, the red ring nematode that is hosted by the South American palm weevil, could also be hosted by our native palm weevil. We're not entirely sure, because hopefully it just doesn't happen. So yep, they're all correct. And then this is just a little bit more information. Since this is recorded, then people can look back and see all this information about these diseases. So thank you guys. And this is all the image credits, just in case you wanted to know.
Quick question. I've been putting 10, 10, 10. My yard is basically sand. I was wondering, just periodically, not, once a month or anything, if that was the correct mix or how to check the pH in my soil.
So I'll jump in there.
Yeah.
If you want me to. If you want
Hello
to.
again.
I figured that was going to get kicked to me.
That's
So,
like I had bug roll.
Definitely what we would recommend to you is to contact the extension office, and we can walk you through getting a soil sample sent up to the soil lab in Gainesville. It's very, very inexpensive, gives you a lot of good information. Generally, if you're talking about fertilization on palms, you're looking at fertilizing those 3, maybe 4 times a year at the most with something called a palm special fertilizer. So it's a fertilizer that has a micronutrient package in it. They definitely need the micronutrients, and generally it's sulfur containing as well. So it will help to lower the pH, which you can only do temporarily anyway. It'll help to lower it. Where are you at in the county?
Right there at 19 and 54 for.
Oh yeah, I can guarantee you your pH is going to be too high for the most part. Now there can be, if you're putting down, depending on what you're putting down, if it's acidifying fertilizer, it might be lower or something, and you might not need that. But you don't know until you get a soil test done. $10 soil test to give you your pH, and it'll give you all of your nutrients that you need to know too. But if
Perfect.
you call us, you can find us online if you Google Pasco County Extension Office. We'll pop up, but then also I'm putting our phone number into the chat, and you can call us and we can send you the information, or you can always come into the office. You're welcome to come in, and we can get you the information that way too.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Any other last minute questions? If not, thank you guys so much for attending this workshop. It was very exciting, and I was happy I could put it on for my home county. And I will be sending you an email shortly about some follow-up surveys. And you guys will be getting a Florida First Detector goodie bag. So please fill out those surveys, because that's how we know who should get a goodie bag. And I think that's it. Whitney, did you have anything else to add?
That's it. Just glad that everybody was able to come, and happy to have you as first detectors.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.